Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Mark Kennedy, Director of the WABA Institute for Strategic Competition here at the Wilson Center. This event is sponsored by the WABA Institute together with the Environmental Change and Security Program. We are honored to have Amos Hochstein here with us today. He is the Special Presidential Coordinator for Global Infrastructure and Energy Security. Mr. Hochstein was given the portfolio to oversee the U.S. government's activities supporting the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, in addition to his ongoing work on energy security. Following service as an advisor to the Foreign Affairs Committee of the U.S. House and to Senators Chris Dodd and Mark Warner, he joined the State Department in 2011, where he led the Bureau of Energy Resources during the Obama administration. Amos is a close advisor to President Biden and is called on to take the lead on many priority assignments, whether it's helping Lebanon and Israel agree on maritime borders or seeking to bridge differences between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Joining me in co-moderating our discussion is Sharon Burke, President of Ecospherics and a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. Ms. Burke has had senior positions in the State Department and Pentagon, most recently as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy. We will each ask a few questions to get things started and then open it up for questions from those in the audience and online, so be thinking of your questions. I'll turn it over to Sharon for the first question.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here and to salute your new program, which I think hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about. Okay. I could not be happier than to be here with Amos Hochstein for so many reasons, including that I've had a chance to see him at work, and so I'm going to ask him like horrible, tough questions that'll just ruin his day. Not really. But I think what I do want to say for the audience is you got from the intro that, you know, this is an impressive person who's doing an important job, but there are a lot of things you can't tell from a title or even from the way someone speaks. So I wanted to make sure you understand that Amos is one of these people who's, I mean, it's almost like the ghost in the machine. He is making things happen, and that's partly who he is, but that's also the position of trust he has in this government. So you may think I haven't heard of that office, I don't know this program, but you do, because he's making things happen. So, in fact, I haven't seen him in a long time because of that, because he's been so busy. So I'm going to just dive right in and ask you a question. You know, my friends across the waters, and I'm talking about the Pentagon, not the other waters, refer to China as the pacing threat. It's not a term that I particularly care for because I think we should set our own pace. But talk to us about the program you're running, and is it an answer to the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road, as it used to be known? Is it an answer? Is it our own? What is it relative to China, and you know, what's the purpose here of this program?
Thank you. Well, first, let me just say thank you for having me, Mark and Sharon, and of course to the Wilson Center. It's a great opportunity to have this conversation, especially with the two of you, with the work both that you've done in the past and that you're doing now in framing these kinds of discussions. I don't see the effort that we're doing as related to anyone, not to China, not to anyone else. Our job as the U.S. government is to address the critical interests of the United States, and within the context of the G7 and the world and the role that the United States plays around the world, is to make sure that we're doing what's in the interest of the rest of the world. And when these issues that we're discussing today, whether it's in infrastructure investment, whether it's in critical minerals, energy security, ICT and digital and telecom, all of these issues, it is true that China has made significant investments over the last 10 to 20 years, and that they have a dominant position in some of them in certain countries in certain regions around the world, specifically sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South America, Central and South America, and even parts of Southeast Asia. But we shouldn't be doing what we're doing because China's doing it, or to catch up to China. What we need to be doing is to recognize what are the interests of the United States. And one, it is to fulfill the promise and the partnership that we need to have with countries in low-income and middle-income countries around the world, not just with wealthy countries. Two, we need to make sure that as we are going through a revolution in energy and a revolution in technology, that everyone around the world gets to benefit from it and rises at the same time, and that the supply chains around the world for those revolutions are diversified and secure. And so that's what so I don't see this as pacing. I see this as really what is in the best interest of the American people, the American economy, of the American government, and as a country that plays a leadership role in the world, what are we doing to make sure that everybody around the world is benefiting from these policies?
Let me ask you a follow-up question before we let Mark jump in. But you talked about the kinds of infrastructure investments we need to make and about energy infrastructure and critical minerals. And this is all about the energy transformation that needs to happen, which calls for a ton of money and a lot of effort. We just had the new UN report, I think came out yesterday or the day before, where it's not good news and we're running out of time. How do we do this? And how do we do this and make the trade-offs? There's been a lot of press about that. We have a legacy energy system that supports a lot of our economy and a lot of the global growth, and we need to change it. Where are these trade-offs, and how do you make that investment?
So that's the hardest question. If we recognize if we agree on the premise that the energy transition that we're really at the beginning of is probably the greatest economic transformation since the Industrial Revolution, of unplugging an entire energy system from one and plugging into another, and that it's not as simple as just unplugging and replugging, and that you have to build up a system from scratch. We're building renewable energy infrastructure, equipment, and then to deployment. That takes time. We need to make sure that that electric vehicles are deployed faster and safer. And we need to do that while we make sure that we still have a functioning economy, meaning that the legacy economy has to continue to function. So you can't just unplug from the first system until you're ready to plug into the other. That requires an enormous amount of coordination and logistics and strategy of how do you do two things at the very same time, which is what President Biden has been talking about doing. One, have to accelerate the energy transition in whatever means we can. And that's the purpose of passing the legislation so that we can do it here at home. It's to provide the financial incentives to do that. We have to seek out resources that will address this emerging need, and to accelerate it means I need everything that goes into these items. So someone once told me a couple of years back, said, once we get out of oil and gas and we get to sun and wind, all of our geopolitics of energy, all our sourcing is going to go away because nobody controls the sun and the wind. That's God or nature. I said, that's great, but the things that capture the sun and capture the wind and turn them into energy are controlled by someone. So we have to do this not only so that we have the items that we need, the products that we need, and the what's in the battery, what produces the cell, or what's inside the wind turbine, but who's making it, and how are they making it, and what's their control of that supply. And all of these decisions have to be made while we're making, you mentioned the UN report, while we're in an urgency of a climate crisis, and we need to still make sure that we have enough fuel and enough heating and electricity from oil and gas to last us through this energy transition. That's a really difficult balancing, and it has all these different plays to it that we have to address, and we do not have time. We have to address it immediately across the board of all of these different functions that go into it.
And I'll turn it over to Mark, but I'm going to leave you with something to stew on, or Mark can pick it up. But when you said, all these things that it takes to capture the wind and the sun and make it usable for energy services, who owns it, who processes it? Full circle, we know who it is. So I would love to take you back to critical minerals and the enormous task ahead of us. But we have so much to talk about, Mark.
Well, we should talk about critical minerals, because when you talk about making that transition in a hurry, mines don't happen in a hurry. They take time. And so we
10
really
years,
don't,
right?
we don't have time. And those electric cars are powered by batteries that have critical minerals in them that are some in America that we're working hard on accessing, but some around the world. So as we look at our infrastructure investment support efforts, which is a key priority of the WABA Institute for Strategic Competition, how do we have the tools? Can we know what is happening, an opportunity to access a mine, to develop a mine? And what kind of challenges are you overcoming to make sure that we're on a fast pace to secure as many sources of critical minerals as we can for this energy transition?
So I'll tell you, one of the most exciting things for me to work on coming into the administration is the area of critical minerals and energy, and not just critical minerals, rare earths, and all the things that go into the supply chain for clean energy. And that's because I started working on energy, 25 years ago, and in the old world, in the 20th century world of dynamics and architecture of energy security meant geopolitics of energy, colored by dramatic events such as our producers of oil boycotting the United States and not allowing us to have access to it, and what does that mean? And large parts of what happened from the 1970s onward was colored by that momentous event, creating the IEA, creating the Strategic Petroleum Reserves, working collectively together. We're falling back into the same architecture, where in the oil business you had an upstream that looked for the oil and produced it, the midstream that refined it, and the downstream that turned it into, whether it was into gasoline, selling it as gasoline or plastic or whatever. Now we have an upstream, which is the critical mineral mining or the rare earths. You have to refine them as well, or smelt them, or process them, depending on the product. And they got to put them into a battery, and then they got to go into a car. So we have to guard against creating the threats to our energy system that existed in the 20th century, once again in the 21st century. So we can't have the current system of where we are today. If you took a snapshot of where we are today, China today, through its work over the last 10 to 20 years, owns a respectable percentage of mines. They have an even larger percentage of refining and processing. And they would like to have a dominant position in battery manufacturing for vehicles. They already have a dominant position in solar manufacturing and a dominant position to some degree in wind. The IRA passage, the legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, is it's not only the biggest dollar-wise investment in clean energy that we've seen ever in the United States. It is also the very basic tool that we need to start changing this dramatically. And it has already had a major change in capital flows and decision-making by corporations around the world that are in the energy space, from that upstream all the way to the car company or the solar manufacturer. So we are going to have more mining in the United States. We're going to have more refining in the United States. We're going to have more battery manufacturing in the United States. We'll have more of those also with free trade agreement countries that we have a free trade agreement with. But what we want is not to stop there. We want this not to have two hubs in the world. One is China, one is the United States. We want there to be multiple hubs of production of critical minerals all the way to the refining and the manufacturing, because we don't want North America to have one market and China to serve the rest of the world. And it's not because I have anything against China from a macro perspective. They have a right to be in this business, and they're going to be, and they're very good at it. But we cannot have a monopoly and a dominant position in the energy sector as we're building a new one, just to go through the same problems that we had and the same national security risks that we had in the 20th century. So what do we do about it? We have to invest across the board. We can't come into countries and say, I just want your resource. That is not going to work. So when you talk about, Mark, the investment in infrastructure, I don't see a difference between the investment in hard infrastructure, ports, roads, rail, and mining. And I don't see the difference between investing in non-Huawei telecom infrastructure that has, as we go to 5G, that is from trusted vendors, not just American, whether it's Nokia or Ericsson or Samsung, doesn't matter. These are all interconnected. If you want to run an energy system, an electricity system in the 5G era, it will matter what infrastructure you have. So suddenly telecom and electricity are the same. And if you want to produce and increase mining, you want to have the efficiency to be able to do that. And that means to have the kind of ports that can manage it and rail that can bring the equipment in and out and product in and out. And we have to make sure that we give governments an option. I'll close with this. I'm sorry for taking long on this one question. It drives the entire thing. We shouldn't come to countries and say, work with our companies or work with us just because it's us. We should do it because we have a better offer for them, not for us. So we should be able to say to a country, if you're going to have a mine that's up for grabs, that's up for a bid, ask yourself a few basic questions. Is the company that is going to bid on this, that will probably have the best bid financially on paper, are they going to bring their workers with them, or are they going to hire local? If they hire local, are they going to train so that they're executives, or are they going to make them the lowest end of the employee pay? Will they pay them more than 50 cents to $1 a day? Will they employ children? Will they pay them a pension, provide health care? And after a couple of years, when those workers walk home, are they going to walk home on a dirt road in the dark to a house without electricity, in a town that has no school, and a city that has no health care? If that's what's happened, you failed. But I'm the failure if I'm not able to provide, and I as the United States, I as the G7, I as the industrial world, if we're not proposing companies and convincing companies to come in who have better reputations, who are going to work with better standards to develop this new world of energy. And to do that, who's going to invest in a mine if it's not connected by rail, it's not connected to a port, it's in a landlocked country where the conditions of transparency are not great, and now you're telling me I can't even get my product out in an efficient manner, which brings about much more problems and chances for corruption and everything else that comes with it. So we have to say to countries, the critical minerals is not us coming and taking the asset away, but rather, how do we use this to build a better diversified economy that is better for your people? And that we can say we are building a new, greener, cleaner economy that is on the back of fair labor, higher standards, environmental protection for the land that they're on. That's what we should be striving for, and I think that's what President Biden is trying to do. That was the promise in the Africa Leader Summit, in our travels at the G20 in Indonesia, and how we're working with some of our allies and partners in South America. That's the world we need to create, and that's what we've launched a year ago, and I think we're on our way to be able to deliver on that.
And just as a quick follow-up, that's a tall order. That's a big task, and it's going to take a lot of folks to get that done. The G7 has come together, I believe, with that shared vision. How do you see those G7 partners, as well as we have similar arrangements with AUKUS, how do you see our partners helping us in collaborating towards that common vision? Because I think they share the same vision that you just outlined.
I think they absolutely do. And here's where we need to collaborate. One is we have to get MDB reform, right? We have to have reform in the international institutions that provide finance, because that is going to help us unlock the private capital that needs to come. We can't finance all of these infrastructure projects just on government money. The task is enormous. And the private sector funding, from private equity to hedge funds to banks in the United States and around the world, and the G7 in particular, are not investing in low and middle income countries. So, but at the end of the day, they're not ideological organisms, they are financial ones. So if we can de-risk those investments, if we can provide the support so that they're not afraid of all three of the ESG components, and doing that through multilateral development banks, through governmental export and financial support institutions, then we can bring them along with us, then we can really unlock. And we're seeing that, so that's one area that we can collaborate. The second is identifying these projects. The one thing that democracies lag behind autocracies is autocracies are really fast. One guy makes a decision, one woman makes a decision, and the check is cut. We have to do due diligence and have to do all the other work that we have to make sure where the money's going, who's getting it, et cetera. That means it's slower, but it still means that it's worthwhile. So by collaborating, we can make sure that when projects are coming up for bid, it may not be an American company, it may be a German company or an Australian company or a French or a British or Italian, it doesn't matter. We are all there supporting each other so that there is this diversified ecosystem. I find myself constantly advocating and promoting non-American companies when that's all there is. And because we need, and we're expecting that our partners and allies will do the same thing in their countries or in others for American companies so that we can have that diversified platform.
You know, when the president announced this, I think over the summer, I think with the G7 announcement of the Global Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment, it's a mouthful, you know, and the acronym of GPII?
PGII, yeah.
Okay, PIGGY?
Catchy.
Okay, no, great program, but one of the things that was really interesting about the announcement was the exemplars of the projects were, one was from the Defense Finance Corporation, one was from the U.S. Agency for International Development, and of course, you know, DoD has the Defense Production Act. There are a lot of pieces, almost too many pieces. Department of Interior, U.S. Geological Survey under them, Department of Energy. We haven't had a governance structure for supply chain and for critical minerals in particular. I mean, I assume that's part of the reason your job was created, was to be an integrator of that. How are we going to do that going forward? Like, those are a lot of pieces. Are the pieces all on the same page?
So first, I think the pieces are absolutely on the same page. I think it's easy when the biggest champion for this kind of initiative is the president. That helps a little bit. And he is very, very focused on this as both a concern and a threat to our national security, not just our economic security, and as are leaders in other countries. And I think that you're right that we have multiple institutions and that have the ability to mobilize finance on behalf of the U.S. government. But that's how our system is built. If we try to come and say, you know Washington as well as anyone, if I went to the Hill today and said, let's create a whole new organism that's going to do this and fund it at a certain level, then in 2030 we will be doing something. But instead, we just passed 3 pieces of legislation that give us an enormous opportunity. It's not just the Inflation Reduction Act, it's the CHIPS Act, and it's the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act.
Right.
These are, when you put them together,
Generational legislation.
these are massive changes because of how much money they are mobilizing and incentivizing.
Yeah.
So if you're going to start building all these things here in the United States, because suddenly you've taken technologies that were, questionable whether they were yet at the point of financial viability, and suddenly you made them financially viable, and now the investment is flowing. Well, now that is going to invigorate a supply chain conversation. Some of us have been having this conversation and the threat of a unipolar dominant force in clean energy supply for several years. But in the last 9 months, we have seen a far more robust discussion across governments, civil society, and corporate on the supply chain question. Why? Because all of a sudden I'm building these factories. Well, where am I going to get the stuff? So suddenly I have to focus on how am I going to get it? Where is it coming from? What's the equity part of it, right? So there's all these questions that are rushing. So what have we done with these three pieces of legislation? We have taken things out of the normal financial and economic cycle of a technology, bringing technology to market, and we've accelerated and compressed it. And now we have to make sure that we have everything that comes along with it. So what we have to do is deal with the institutions that we have. My job, as you said correctly, is to coordinate the different efforts from the DFC, from the Exim Bank and MCC and USAID and Department of Energy, and all of those efforts combined, together with KfW in Germany and DFAT and all the other institutions around the world. And we all work together to identify, okay, how can we mobilize capital to these different projects? And some of them we're seeing projects that we are advocating together on lithium and batteries that will mobilize American projects that have in them now a French, a German, an American, and an Italian company with an Australian. This doesn't happen overnight and doesn't happen, and never happens on its own. But when we can collaborate, I'll tell you this one last thing. When we compete, when there's a bid, and there's an actual competition, we win almost every time. But there are a lot of bids in a lot of places, and we have to mobilize a lot of companies that are not used to working in these environments. The number of dollars that are invested, of the trillions that were announced on climate, are more and more invested in OECD countries. The number of dollars that are invested in non-OECD countries is declining. And we have to change that. And this is the opportunity. I've said it before, the energy transition is an opportunity for an Africa transition. And that's where we can all come together to work on this. And I think we have the tools. It's about implementing them.
So besides the energy transition, if you think of another area where it's vital to the development of a nation that we would be partnering with, it's vital to our economy, and it also has security dimensions, is in the communication space. And the communication space is innovating at a very rapid pace. So there are the traditional providers you already mentioned, Nokia, Ericsson, Samsung. There's Open RAN, which is opening up a whole new suite of providers. There's low Earth orbit satellites that are allowing the satellite communications. What opportunities you see, what challenges do we need to overcome in order to make sure that there's a secure telecommunications, communications backbone around the world, not just here at home?
So step one, I think, is to understand and to get a uniform understanding of the concern and why we should care about this. And when you move, when you're deploying infrastructure and technology and software in this space, and you do it with a non-trusted vendor who will use the ability to be in your system to not just from a national security invasive and therefore create national security threats, but mostly for corporates, will create that threat of information gathering and privacy and lack of privacy protection. So there has to be a understanding of that level of concern. And that's across every industry. And what I would hate people to think is that this is a government problem. It is not. The increase in cyber attacks is not just against governments. The energy industry is actually one of the most prone for these attacks, but they're happening against everything, from hospitals to schools to other corporations. So having secure telecom systems doesn't just mean government secure, but just trusted vendors that you can work with. Now, what's happened with Huawei is that they have come in and invested over the last 10, 20 years in the infrastructure at 2G and 3G, and now they want to do the upgrades into 5G. And 5G is not just an upgrade of 4G, it's a completely different technology that has far, far bigger implications because of the capabilities. So we want to make sure that there are opportunities for a diversified portfolio of companies and technologies. We want to and that they're not taken out of the market by essentially dumping with offering at near zero costs sometimes to get into the system, because the first check is zero, but then you're hooked for life on that technology, and to have a different offering. So we're doing two things in that. One is encouraging and bolstering specifically on the 5G side, alternatives and making sure that it's diversified. Again, we're not selling, this is not America coming and saying buy America. It's buy anything that is from a trusted vendor. Second is encouraging the advancement of Open RAN that you mentioned before, to have a more open platform that in of itself is more secure and that develops into an alternative and to the existing platforms and could then compete because of its nature, in its open nature. And we have done that through U.S. government agencies. We are working with providers and companies, technology innovators in the United States, in Japan, and across Europe to advance Open RAN again, to accelerate the adoption, perhaps faster than it would have been. Telecom moves at a slower, the development of telecom generations of technology happens at a slower rate than other parts of high tech. And what we'd like to see is Open RAN catch up a little bit faster to be able to provide that kind of an alternative. We see a lot of success in this. We have been a funder through U.S. government of alternative companies that are willing to work in Africa. And I can tell you that in the case of one of those companies, when they entered Angola, by the time, within 9 months of being on the ground and opening up for services, they were able to achieve over 40% market share. So again, it's about, we can't force anybody to buy anything. But if you offer that alternative, we think that it was going to work. And from my experience over the last year and a half of doing this, when we offer that alternative, when we come in with some financial, not grants, but financing, we win almost every time.
Mark, I already have some great questions online, and I know you wanted to start with the folks in the room with the questions that I think we're ready for you, if you're ready for us.
So we have people in the audience to bring up a mic to you. We'd like to have you state your name and your affiliation for your questions. I'm going to take just the 3 questions to begin with for Amos to answer. We'll batch a couple of them together. Right down here.
Thank you very much. Michael Keyes from the Kennan Institute. Very interesting presentation. I've generally focused on the security world where there's a persistent American perception that Europe free rides on America, and NATO is a good example of that. And that's been around for decades, that view. So approaching this whole issue on energy and transitioning to a new energy framework, I guess I'd like to play the skeptic and kind of put some ideas out there to get your reaction to them. I would suggest that the American people aren't convinced about the global team approach that you've described, where the Germans and the French benefit, and then in some cases they'll advocate on our behalf. I'm not sure that the American people believe that. I think that they are skeptical. The American people don't understand what this new energy framework is that we're trying to move to, and they're skeptical about the idea of unplugging from something that they know and plugging into something that's still being built. They see desperation in our reaching out to international partners to help them to build it. In other words, to build a demand for something which the American people aren't necessarily demanding. So based on that, if I'm right, or if this skeptical viewpoint is correct, I should say, if we can't even convince the American public, if like 50% of the American public isn't convinced of this, how do we think we can convince countries like Guyana and Suriname that have potential huge offshore oil deposits that they should also get in on the game on this, when they've got something right there in front of their faces, and other countries that are already tapping into these more traditional forms of energy?
All right, let's go over here for another question right up in the front.
Thank you all. I wanted to ask a bit more about the partners that you mentioned.
Can you just introduce yourself
Yes.
first?
Hi, I'm James Nyes. I'm at the Europe Center's, the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council. I wanted to ask more about the partner organizations that you see for the U.S., in particular the 3Cs Initiative, which is a Central European launch and lead initiative on energy, digital for people who might not be aware. As we consider kind of learning more about Ukraine's reconstruction and some of the opportunities for integration in the European market space, how does the 3Cs Initiative fit into the administration's strategy to support global infrastructure and investments, as well as when will the administration deliver on its commitment last year to invest $300 million in the investment fund for the 3Cs?
Why don't we take it just a couple rows back with the red pocket square? Or?
Thank you. My name is Danielle Abraham. I'm the director of an Israeli nonprofit organization dealing with food security around the world. And actually, I wanted to raise this subject, which I thought was conspicuous by its absence so far, in that we know today we're really facing a global food crisis. And I think the vulnerabilities in our food systems were really revealed by both COVID, obviously the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and compounded by the fact that we're facing climate change and water scarcity. And I think this is a critical subject when it comes to infrastructure, and not just the physical infrastructure, but also key for an agricultural transformation, which is the knowledge and innovation capacity. And obviously representing Israel, but many other countries, the US has very strong allies who can help the US come to those other countries with a better offer, exactly as you said. How can we convince them that we're offering something better? So I wanted to ask about the administrations and your view on the nexus between food security and infrastructure, and perhaps how that can play out with the allies around the world.
Well, you got three meaty questions. We'll let you take those on.
All right, I'll do them in order. One, I really do think that you and I have a very different view of both Europe and the American people, but I don't view Europe as free riders. I think if anybody had that view before the Ukraine war, I sure hope that that has taken away any of the doubts about any such accusation. Europe has been a tremendous partner to the United States for the entirety of the Cold War and ever since. So I think this is 80 years of partnership that we don't agree on everything, but we are certainly agree on the values proposition of global leadership. As far as the American people, what I see is we are advancing very quickly and beating expectations of deployment of renewable energy, and it's not fast enough. So I'm a critic of how fast we're going. I think it should go faster. I think our permitting and our state, local, federal, we have to go faster. We have to be able to not just build the stuff, we have to actually connect it to the grid, and we have to have a resilient grid. But that's why the president advocated for the Infrastructure Act, to be able, because none of this happens on its own. It needs money to do it, and governments, when we're doing such a massive transformation, the government has to step in and do it. It's happened with every other transformation. So what I see is when an electric vehicle comes on the market, it has a 2 to 3 year wait period. That means to me that the question is not of demand, it's of supply. So I think the people are there. We're seeing more and more people who want to see deployment of cleaner and more renewable energy, and to make us less dependent and more reliant on not only clean but more secure energy sources. We're not in the business of we're not going to force people to do anything. They have to make these choices. We have to talk about what we believe is our values. We have to lead with our values, and some of those are the fact that we believe that there is a climate crisis, and we do need to take action. It may not be, to Sharon's point earlier, there are those who say we're not doing it fast enough and we're not making enough of a dent, but we got to die trying. And that's why we have put such a focus on this. And so I think that I think the American people that I view, again, people think about this issue of energy in Washington along political lines. So you leave Washington, or you give a lecture somewhere, and you ask the first question, what's the state in America that has the best rates of wind deployment? And they start giving you blue states because they think it's ideological. But the reality, it's Texas. If you want to look at who wants to build a green hydrogen hub in their state, it is ruby red states, because it's only about politics in very small groups of people here in Washington, but out there in the country, it's one of the biggest economic engines. What Republican governor doesn't want to see investment in renewable energy? Where is Ford and GM announcing that they're building these electric vehicle plants? It's in Tennessee and in Kentucky. And where's the lithium mining going to be? In South Carolina. And where is the refining going to be? In Tennessee. So I think this is a much broader consensus around this than is represented in either public discourse or in our body politics. When it comes to the 3Cs Initiative, look, I was there on the day we launched it with the president of Croatia during the Obama administration. I think it's a very important initiative to be able to bring that group of countries together on infrastructure. My fundamental belief, which is why we fashioned the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment around the word infrastructure, is because I believe fundamentally that we have to have physical interconnection that will lead to physical integration. And that will give us more security, less conflict, and will support countries regardless of their level of income. Now, rich countries can build their own infrastructure, they can issue bonds, and they can use other financial instruments to do that, to finance it, while lower income countries don't have those luxuries. So we have to step in. It's not just our moral obligation, but it is actually our tactical and our strategic interest to step in and support that, which is why we support the 3Cs Initiative. When it comes to the investment, as you know, there's been different discussions on how to do that, and that's debt versus equity, and the role of the DFC in that, and probably this is not the right place to adjudicate that issue, but I know that folks have great intention, and I know the Atlantic Council that you represent has been a champion and a leader in this space, and we applaud that, want to continue that work. On food security, I'm really glad that you raised it. It is one of the pillars of what I want to focus on. But let me use this as the same example that I gave before of things that are interconnected, and we think that they're not. We think that there is telecom, and there's hard infrastructure, and there's energy, and there's food, and there's health. They're all integrated. What we learned specifically, not just COVID, but I think because COVID is such that unicorn of an event, hopefully, I may be proven wrong next year, but I really hope it's a unicorn. But the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia invades Ukraine, and it's not a war in Europe. It is a devastating blow to food security around the world because so much of that food is coming from both Russia and Ukraine combined. And like in any other case, rich countries will figure it out, even if they were highly dependent, and poor countries will not. So in the Africa Leaders Summit, we talked about how do we make this a great pillar, an important pillar in this, in our collaboration. But here's the thing. You can talk all you want about creating large-scale farming in sub-Saharan Africa or in other areas, in landlocked countries. Because what you need is, you're gonna need the soil, so you don't get to choose to do it just wherever you want. If you're in a rocky area, it's a lot harder to, so you're gonna have to choose the strategic locations for where you're gonna do it. You're gonna have to have access to water and irrigation. You're not gonna start wanting to build piping of water that goes across thousands of miles. And you have to have a market economy. You have to have where to sell it, because you're not doing it for the local economy. That we know how to do. And many countries, including Israel, has been very helpful to countries on irrigation, but that's all small scale. If you want to do large scale agriculture and have food security by Africa for Africa, it's going to require a change of whole suite of infrastructure. So if you're going to do it in a country that has the water, in an area that has the water, has the soil, but it's going to take 4 days to put it on trucks to get it to a port because there's no distribution, and it's in fairly hot temperatures, so you may need refrigerated trucks. You're going to go in areas that don't have good roads. The bridges are relatively weak, so you're going to have weight restrictions on those trucks, so a refrigerated truck is already heavy. Now you can only fill it halfway, and that's what's happening, right? Copper is only filled halfway too. And now you got to get to Durban, or you got to get to Dar es Salaam or some other place where you can distribute that. If you did everything I just described, you've blown through your margin. Agriculture doesn't have that big of a margin of profit to be able to support that kind of an effort. And therefore, if we talk about building rail and building roads, and we're doing that because we're trying to get to the critical minerals area, it would be a mistake to see that as, oh, you're just doing this because you want the extraction. Once again, the extractive industries are going to win. That's not the case. It's because that is a way to finance and incentivize so that we can get rail all the way to where the agriculture. If we can have high-speed, efficient, financially plausible, bankable projects for rail that can go to that area from the port inland, then we can actually extend that to food security. If you have the rail, now you can take advantage of all the things you talked about before, which are using high tech, using high efficiency, use of water that is much smaller use of water. We can do much better in use of water, and the technologies are advancing very quickly. But all of those can't start being utilized for large-scale farming until we can solve the infrastructure piece. And then we need electricity, because most of those technologies require electricity. And if you want to have high efficiency, having a 5G connection and fiber optic cabling that is there is going to make it even more efficient. So if you want food security for real and not a photo op, you're going to have to make the investments. You're going to have to build a rail. But if you build rail, the beauty of it is, it's the old British Telegraph, right? You build fiber optic cable and electricity lines. And that's what comes with it. We have to get the reforms in the financial world and the incentivizing of governments, multilateral development banks, and ultimately the private sector to finance these kinds of projects. If we do it, it's not that hard, and we can make an unbelievable difference that will take us from getting fairer, more just, and equitable mining practices so that we can have faster distribution of batteries for electric vehicles, and we can do it by supporting the communities there of having more mobile telephone and broadband connection into the rural areas, have better farming, more food security that is more affordable, and you actually get the entrepreneurship that comes with it. So it creates the jobs. And that's the vision.
Yep.
That's what we can do, and it's within our grasp to be able to do that.
So I'm going to bundle these last questions for you, but just also say I really like Danielle's question because she also wrapped into it that infrastructure is not just steel and concrete, but it's also innovation and education and the human element of it, which it sounds like that's part of your program as well. So it's the vision you just laid out is everything. And let me get these questions back to our Kennan Institute friend too. One thing that I know you've talked about a lot is that we do need to develop our resources at home, and our industrial base at home. We cannot do it alone. So I think there is a tendency for Americans to be like, we can do this, but we need friends and we need allies and we need partners. And I think that's been an important part of your message. We need to develop minerals at home, but we need to develop them around the world too. And it may be that that's a message that people are beginning to understand. Let me get to the questions. Steve Brundage, who's a retired State Department official, asked a really important question. You said earlier that one of the problems with the oil and gas was we don't want to walk down the same roads. The mistakes that we all made, governance, corruption, that was also part of it. It undermined people's governments. How do we make sure we're not repeating that? And that's also a question of transparency, which I think you mentioned as well. And Steve said that mining can be an opportunity for local and national development, but it also comes at a cost for the local communities. And I believe when you were saying our investment is not just extractive, it's in the community, that's what you're addressing. So I think that's good. And other people asked about de-risking and how do you de-risk. Let's wrap up all these questions and then you could just take them all. Elizabeth Losos from Duke University said, you've got a lot of pressure to produce quick and visible results. So how do you make sure that the partnership takes the time and deliberation to prioritize high-quality infrastructure. Like, you don't want to get it cheap, you want to get it good, but you need to deliver fast. How do you reconcile all of that? The last question that I really love, because it's something that I love to talk about and would love to hear you talk about, which is deep sea mining is something that's come up, right? And of course, the United States is not competitive for this because we have not ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And there's a question now about that as an opportunity, but also a trade-off where it may be damaging deep sea ecosystems. If you have anything to say about that and where you think we come down on that. There's a few other questions, but I think that's a lot. So let's just leave it with those.
All right. I'll try to do this in lightning.
It's a lot of waterfront.
I'll try to do this in lightning form. On governance, corruption, and the communities, I thought that's what I was trying to convey, is that absolutely.
You did.
The part of
Do it
the
again.
alternative of the proposition that we think that we should be offering is that it's not just good for us. I'll repeat what I said before, we can't look like we're coming in for the extractive industries again.
Right.
We're coming in, we want the product, we're gonna take it, we're gonna leave it, we're gonna have our electric vehicles, we don't really give a damn what's gonna happen here.
No
So we have
extractive
to have.
industry, no extractive policy.
So we have to have, but to do that, we have to incentivize also the bigger and more trusted mining companies who have avoided certain jurisdictions because of their fear of corruption and fear of lack of governance. And they have said, you know what, it ain't worth it. I'm publicly traded, one bad story, and it may generate cash flow, but it's going to be a drag on my stock. So smaller companies who don't care about that or are not publicly traded will come and say, all I care about is the cash flow. So if I get the cash flow, I'm in. And I don't have any incentive. And if somebody has a bad story about me, what do I care? I don't have shareholders. I am the shareholder. So I'll do what I want, which is certain countries' companies also have that approach. They don't care. So we have to incentivize the better actors to say, here's a proposition where you get to come in and use your better standards. It may increase cost a little bit, but the country is going to be incentivized to have you as a partner because you'll also invest in that community. And you'll be better political partners, and they won't be one-and-done leaders because the people will not be upset with the fact that they're not benefiting from the billions of dollars that are being generated. So that leads me to the question of prioritization. Yes, we have to prioritize and not just the fastest project we can do, but one where we're not part of the same exact problem. I mean, we haven't even talked about the debt traps that, China has come in and given a lot of debt, create a lot of debt. And what happens is, in the first few years, it's great. Zero interest is always good. Then that political leader is gone, the successor's there, it's been 12 years, and now I'm saddled with an enormous amount of debt that I'm going to turn to the IMF and ask for the rest of the world to bail me out and pay the Chinese on my behalf. That's not a sustainable story. So countries have to start looking around and say, at the front end, this is a raw deal. I don't want a deal. I don't want to sit with this enormous amount of debt. But what choice do I have if I got to fight something with something?
If the money's there.
So I have to make sure that, we have to our job is collectively to incentivize folks to, the right companies with better standards to come in and make those investments. And as government, when we finance, we're going to do the due diligence. And we're going to try to go as fast as we can, but not against risking value. And the cheapest way to do something is to pay for it. So I think that's a lesson that I talk about in my travels all the time to governments. Like, yeah, you think that was a better choice because it cost less. Where are you now 7 years later? You've had to rebuild half of it. You haven't gotten the benefits from it. When it comes to deep sea mining, look, first we have to differentiate between deep sea mining and deep sea extraction, which is not mining.
You mean like nodules?
Nodules,
Yeah.
and so on. And I think we're at the beginning of this conversation. You're 100% right. We are not signatories to UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and that restricts and ties our hands to some degree. I think that there is a lot that has to be done on understanding the long-term environmental impacts on oceans and waterways from deep sea mining. And on the extraction, I think it's obviously the nodules have a less of a concern on that. But I think we all need to understand, there are smarter people than me that are looking into the science and to understand the long-term effects. But I think that would be something that would be dangerous, on the one hand, to support a cleaner environment, and on the other hand, degrade it at the same time, when so much damage has been done to our oceans already. I would hate to, in the name of expediency and climate action, to do something that was against it. If there was a way to do it that was in a clean, sustainable, and safe way, then obviously that has great opportunity in it.
Informed trade-offs.
Indeed.
So this has been a great conversation. I know we got a lot more questions out there. We could go on for another hour. Amos, we very much appreciate you coming here today. Very revealing answers that you've given us, a big challenge you've given us to try to meet. But I think when we think about the world, not just our interests, but the world's interests, we both are aligned to need to achieve many of the goals you've outlined. So thanks again for being with us here today. Thanks everybody for joining us here in the audience and online. So from the Wilson Center, we look forward to being with you at a future program.